Happy New Year, everyone. I hope this year is successful for everyone and that we, as a planet, finally start getting over the ordeals of the last 2 years. This is the first podcast of 2022, and it's a bit different, albeit very interesting. Alright, let's first cover some other things before we get into it. Hanwei Forge produces not only Chinese-style swords and weaponry, but they also produce Japanese swords, as well as European types. They are meticulous about their products and have a high standard of quality that they adhere to, which sets them apart from many such companies. They range from basic entry-level items all the way up to exquisite collector's pieces. You may view their products at their official website, which is hanweimetal.com. While the website is in Chinese, it's quite self-explanatory, and the general manager, Mr. Gilbert Poon, can speak English and is highly accommodating to customers. So if you have any queries or would like to contact them for an order, you may do so by email at gilbertpoon@hanweimetal.net. The links are in the show notes and description. Moving on to some Mushin martial culture news. I have released the third part of an ongoing interview series with Xu Xiaodong. In this episode, he discusses the Mabao Guo incident, as well as what led up to his issues with the Chen village people. Village people? No, not those village people. The Chen Taiji Chuan people that he started to have some clashes with. Anyway, do go check it out. I will be releasing further episodes of this soon, and some other endeavors, including the next Shuaijiao history episode, so keep an eye out. Okay, as you know, the various Mushin martial culture merchandise is available on my Teespring store. The newly released Spear, King of Weapons hoodies have been quite popular now during the winter season. There are t-shirt versions available as well. If you feel like supporting this podcast indirectly, getting some of the Mushin martial culture merchandise is one way to do it. You can find the store at the link in the show notes. Another way to support this podcast, as well as all the other Mushin martial culture endeavors, is through Patreon. There are general support tiers and a third tier, the Huajin tier, in which you can study the arts of Xingyiquan and Baguazhang in depth. There is already quite an extensive library of lessons on the arts, with additional lessons released regularly. If you are interested in learning Xingyiquan or Baguazhang, give the course a try. The Patreon site may be found at patreon.com/Mushin Martial Culture. That's all one word, Mushin Martial Culture. Again, the links are in the show notes. All right, let's get into today's episode. Today's podcast features Richard Amos. This podcast is slightly different, as Richard is a Japanese karate practitioner. He is a highly respected and skilled teacher of the art who has an incredibly interesting life story. I became aware of Richard Amos and his story through a book he wrote and published in 2020 named Chasing Bushido, How I Learned to Just Say Oss. This book, which is a memoir, recollects Richard Amos's life in karate and his 10 years of training in Japan at the headquarters of the Japanese Karate Association, where he went on to become the first European graduate of its intense instructors course. He was the second Westerner to complete this course in the organization's history. Richard did this in the relatively early days of the organization, at a time when the intensity and brutality of the training was known worldwide. His story echoed that of many of us who have given up our lives in the West to travel to the origin of an art to learn it. The book is a wonderful read for any martial artist, and a glimpse into the mind of Richard, who has been immersed in karate with his mind, body, and soul for his entire life. I highly recommend the book, and a link is in the show notes. So, without further delay, I give you Richard Amos. Okay, welcome to the Drunken Boxing Podcast, Mr. Richard Amos. Sensei Richard Amos, welcome. I'm happy to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, simply based on, a few little clips and rumors out there, and I appreciate you having me on.
Well, actually, it's quite an interesting story as to how I came to know of you. Because you would be the first. My podcast is mostly focused on Chinese martial arts. I've had other people with other backgrounds on once or twice, but in general, most of the guests are Chinese martial artists. But how I came to know about you was through a good friend of mine who actually trains with my teacher. He's my martial art brother here. He's a chap from Ireland. His name is Gerard Klein. And he's been training with my teacher probably for I'd say 5 years or so. So I've known him for quite a bit of time. But he's originally from Ireland, and he himself was a JKA instructor when he was back in Ireland. And he initially told me about, because I love reading about martial arts. I love listening to people's journeys. I think all the martial arts are wonderful. That's why, having different people from different backgrounds on is great. And he mentioned to me, I think it was prior to your book being published, about you and your book. And he sent me a link, and I think it was you doing a reading from your book.
Oh, okay, yeah, I did a couple of those on Facebook.
It was on Facebook. Exactly. It was on Facebook. And I loved it. And then I was waiting for the book. I was just waiting for the release, and I had to get it, and I read the book, and here we are. So that's basically...
That's great to hear. Initially I was sort of wondering about that because obviously you're very heavily focused on Chinese martial arts, and I'm kind of a specialist in what I do. So I don't really cross over that much, not with any depth to other arts outside of what I've done in Japan.
Right.
So listening to your other podcast, I thought to myself when you were chatting to these different characters, I thought, I've got a couple of things I could say there, so I wouldn't be totally irrelevant.
Oh, great. Well, your book is, once again, and a lot of the guests that I've had on are people that have gone deeper into the arts of Chinese martial arts. So they're people that have either left their home countries and traveled and lived in China, etc., for a long, periods of years to immerse themselves in the study of these arts. And that's exactly what you did. So I'm going to quickly firstly mention your book, because I'm sure people are asking or wondering what that is. And it's titled Chasing Bushido, How I Learned to Just Say Oss. And it's your basically memoir of your journey, leaving your home. Maybe you could give a little bit of a background of your...
Yeah, so I had a few notes on this 20 odd years ago, and the idea of something to write because to be honest, I'd read a few Aikido stories and some stuff from China, and there were, things of, characters going to the Shaolin temple and writing their experiences and all that sort of stuff. And there'd been a few written about karate in Japan, but they were there was one great book written in the early 60s, which gave a sort of beginner's intro into Japan and life in the center of the JKA and how brutal it was and all that sort of stuff. And that was a great book. But since then...
Was that Angry White Pajamas?
No, this is from the early 60s. This was Moving Zen. Moving Zen was written by a Canadian, C.W. Nichol, who sadly passed away fairly recently. And he went there on, I believe, for karate, of course, but he was also studying, oceanography and all these other things. And so he got very involved in Japanese sustaining wildlife and the natural environment and all that sort of stuff. And became, you could say a television celebrity. Because he was an expert in his field and he spoke Japanese very well, and they're always very marketable on Japanese TV. So that was the sort of benchmark, and no one had really come close to that because I didn't feel that anyone had written something that sort of was cinematographic in a sense, where it put you in the scene and it had you feel the same emotions and all the rest of it. So I wanted to write something very, very anecdotal that would draw the listener in, and perhaps they would be able to relate with their own experiences, et cetera, a sort of archetype, if you like. And I think that's probably where it may have appealed to you, because it is an archetype, and therefore it's not only specific to what I do.
Yeah.
It's specific to anyone that's sacrificed a lot for something they believe in. And, it's kind of romantic in a way, to go off and not know anything about the place you're going to and just sort of try and survive, really. And my wife was very encouraging, because she said that in the middle classes, if I were telling a story about one sensei or another and what things were like in a certain training session or a certain tournament, and she said that people would stop and they really would listen. And you don't notice when you're chatting away, you're glancing around and you think that maybe I'm talking too much. Let's get back to the action. But she said that people loved it. So that was a bit of a boost. And then a colleague of mine at the time put out another book, and a lot of people said to me, should have been your book that went out first. So that kicked me out the backside, and I got it done. And of course, lockdown helped because it allowed me to edit it as it should be edited, really in a sort of saturation way. Yeah. Prior to that, I'd have a great Sunday and then I wouldn't look at it for 3 months. So
no, I know. I have the same thing because I've been working, but it's not a memoir. It's a translation and explanation of the classical text on the style that I practice, and it's
wonderful.
It's over 7 years in the works, and I had the same thing. I would get a fire under me and get really, into a section, and then I wouldn't look at it for 4 months, and then I'd go back and look at previous sections and still not be happy with them, and then, then that's just how it is.
I mean, the worst thing is that you write a good section and then you read through everything, you think, oh God, I've got to raise everything else up because this is getting a little bit better now. So you get rid of the flat stuff, but don't let anyone tell you to that you've done enough and you've just got to put it to bed. It's only you can be ready for that.
Yeah.
I'm glad I took as long as I took, to be honest.
Well, it's a wonderful book. You mentioned things of archetypes, and it definitely is. I mean, it's something that reaches further out of martial arts, but I would say that anybody that's involved in martial arts and has a genuine interest in these aspects of journeys and, as you mentioned, archetypes, it's really it's highly recommended. And
that's very nice of you. Thank you very much.
I just I recalled these the people that you mentioned, and we can get into them a bit later, but you brought them to life. You really did. I mean, these are people that even myself, as a non-Japanese martial art, non-karateka, I'm not a Japanese karate practitioner, you brought them to life in a way that in my head it's as if I know them, and I think you did a superb job of that, and it's
oh, that's terrific to hear. I mean, that was the goal, and because reading the stories and recounting the events, I got excited, and I just thought, I'm writing this for myself. These are the stories I wanted to hear prior to going to Japan, and you get these sort of sort of cookie cutter interviews where they ask the same questions and you get the same sort of diplomatic answer, and you never really get to know who these people are. And what was interesting was that people have a real definite idea of who this sensei is and who that sensei is, but they've never met them, and they've only sort of seen photos or read an interview which is full of stock questions and stock answers. So I wanted to layer these things and show everyone, and you've got your hero and you've got your villain, but of course, like all heroes and villains, it's not that black and white. They're real gray areas, and they're much more layered than that. And I hope you picked up on that. But it's I'm so pleased that it sort of, for want of a better word, resonated with you, and that was the goal of the book, to excite people to train and to excite people to follow their dreams, really.
Yeah, well, this martial arts brother of mine, we still train together on a weekly basis. And in the past, he would talk about, these charismatic and larger-than-life Japanese instructors that would tour through Europe and Ireland, and he'd go and attend instructors' trainings and things. But after I read your book, he was mentioning names, and I was like, now I can really relate to him recollecting these stories. So, and that group of the first group of the JKA were Shotokan teachers that were teaching outside of Japan. I don't know, what was it, the 60s, the 70s when they first started?
Well, mid 60s they all started coming over and setting up shop, if you like, and they stayed until they died, and I'm sad that they're all dying now. I mean, they've reached a ripe old age, and that generation is sort of fading, and I don't think they really built a very good hierarchical structure outside of Japan, because in Japan, of course, hierarchy rules everything.
Right.
And I'm sure it's pretty similar in China.
Yeah.
But what these guys did in Europe and the US as well is they came over, they were young men, really, mid-20s, late 20s maybe. And there was such a huge chasm between them and the students, and they were held as real gods. And that once you do that for 10, 20 years, no one's going to bridge that gap between you. And so when they left a huge gaping void. And consequently, of course, we've got all these splits and everything split up, which I understand. It's just the way it is. But they were pretty special, yeah. But, I mean, post-war Japan, I mean, post-war anywhere, but especially Japan after the two bombs.
Yeah.
To rebuild that, obviously they were crushed, but the ones who were like super tough were the ones who emerged, at the top of the field in karate. So, they've lived through all that, and you can't really replace that. I'm very glad I had crossed over those eras of those characters and the new characters.
You were, I mean, in many aspects, you were one of the early pioneers that did what you did by going over to Japan and then becoming.
Well, I don't think I was a pioneer, but I do think that I was able to have perspective on the earlier stuff and then the transitional stuff.
Right.
And I think the early pioneers, the Stan Schmidt senses and all those guys that came from South Africa, I mean, they were close to the rest of the world, but they had a free-for-all in Japan. So they were tough guys, and a lot of them went to Japan in the 60s and 70s when no one else would have them. And so all they knew, they were, forgive me, I mean, I know you're from South Africa, they were not very sophisticated, shall we say. Yeah. So they took everything at face value. Those guys were tough. We're going to do it tough. They beat up their juniors. We're going to beat up our juniors. So they transposed the whole culture. And I mean, in a way, it was a real golden era for those guys. I mean, woe betide anyone that didn't come to scratch. They were probably harshly treated, but they were sort of stuck in that paradigm. And it's not really my character to get stuck in a paradigm. And I started traveling mid-'80s.
Okay.
And I realized even in the late 80s, I was somewhat senior, because I'd started quite early. And you'll be pleased to hear I started because I just fell for Bruce Lee. 10 years old, I mean, it was just, that was it for me.
It was me. Bruce Lee was the reason for me too. I mean, I wanted to do martial arts after I saw a Bruce Lee movie. Not Jackie Chan, rather. Chuck Norris was in there too. I mean, I had seen him, but Bruce Lee was the one that sent me over the edge.
Well, I mean, obviously I pay my respects to him in the book because he was the catalyst.
You do.
And, just the way he was. And also for me, he wasn't, I don't know, I think he wasn't too foreign as well, if you see what I mean. I could relate to him. Obviously he was born in the US and lived in the US for a long time, but he also had a little bit of European blood in him.
Yeah.
So he wasn't too extreme off the charts, unrecognizable in terms of my being able to relate to who he was and how he looked and how he behaved and everything else.
Right.
And that's all you need. You just need a reference point that you can relate to, and then you're off and running.
Yeah.
But in those days, it just wasn't any. I mean, I may well have started Kung Fu if there was a great place nearby. But at 10, 11 years old, you can't really pick and choose.
Same with me, in fact. I mean, full disclosure, I started with Judo, actually, because that was available at my school. And I was chasing Bruce Lee, but Judo was available. And I'm very happy I did. I like Judo. I think it's very good for kids, especially I was 6. So 6, 7, 8, I think it's very good for that age group.
Oh, for sure. I mean, sadly, I met my wife. We're a little bit too old to have kids, but if I had a kid, I wouldn't start them on karate. I'd start them on Judo.
Yeah, I think there's something. Kids at that age when they're trying to figure out their bodies and their natural tendencies, just tend to strive towards more wrestling, kind of rough and tumble, and I think Judo is a nice way for them to understand and control that. At the same,
definitely, yeah. Well, sort of roughhousing with rules.
Exactly, and then they start to understand their body through that, through that lens, and it's a wonderful base, I think. But my uncle, my dad has 2 brothers, one older, one younger. My eldest, his eldest brother, which is my oldest uncle, who was always a role model for me growing up, was a karate instructor, but he was a Shotokan instructor, and both my dad and my uncle practiced it as well. And you know,
Yeah, was this in Japan?
in South Africa, yeah, in South Africa. So I
In Johannesburg?
in Pretoria, in fact, my
Oh, okay, yeah.
so.
Oh, yeah. Mm.
And my uncle was somebody I always looked up to because of his discipline. He was also very stern, and that's was the shadow that I remember him casting on me, and I think it did influence my martial arts quite, subconsciously for the rest of my life. That he was the kind of role model that I was trying to become.
Mm.
The big uncle, the responsible uncle, no nonsense, very disciplined, but he just man of few words but great presence.
Well, there you go. I mean, that's just in your nature and in mine too, to see a strong, somewhat forbidding character and be inspired by that. Some people will shy away from that, or be afraid of it, but it inspires me.
Yeah, yeah. So it was very influential on my life, and as it has been with yours. But you started karate in England, and
Yeah.
what was the I mean, you do explain your path in the book, but in general, what was your drive to go to Japan and carry on there?
Well, I mean, I think karate and the Japanese connection, just I had an affinity for it, and I don't think I would have had the same affinity for a Chinese art. I don't know why. It's just a feeling I have. Maybe it's just easy to look back in retrospect and say, yeah, that fitted together. I don't know, but the Japanese aesthetic, um, the uh, the simplicity, the clean lines. This to me am I talking about culture or karate? They sort of blend, so perfectly in that way. But
Yes.
I I would look around me even as a young child, and I didn't get why society made you sort of conform to things that weren't necessarily your true character.
Mm.
And there's a wonderful, you probably know him, there's an English educator. He sadly died quite young. He had some health complications. Sir Ken Robinson.
Hmm.
And he's done TED Talks and lectures and all this sort of thing. Brilliant, brilliant orator. But he was an educationalist. And he always said, you should never ask how intelligent is the child. You should ask how is the child intelligent. And I love that
That's great.
quote.
That
And,
really is
and
great.
I felt that from a very young age where, if someone, whether it was me or someone else or a friend of mine, wasn't very good at something, there would be a certain amount of ridicule, even from the teacher.
Mm.
And I just didn't like that at all. And I always used to think, well, what happens if you're just going to be brilliant at something which is outside the paradigm of this person who's got authority? Where does that leave you? I mean, you're just in danger of missing your whole life path. And I felt that as a very young child. And, you sort of feel that, well, that's just the way life is. But that bothered me. And I got an apprenticeship with an oil company. And so I thought, I'll just do the right thing. I'll be an engineer and I'll do this and this. I'll do a man's job, and take my place in society. But I would daydream all the time of one of these characters. Inoue Sensei was obviously my first Japanese influence. I just had daydreams of him coming to the place I was working and just saying, "Come on, we go to Japan tomorrow," and just walking away, smirking that I'd been saved, from a life of not a life that was not necessarily invalid, but a life that didn't suit me.
Right.
And I was just willing to drop everything. And writing the book, I find it extraordinary. I know I'm talking about myself here, but there was no end game. There was no goal. There was no, well, if I do that, I have this. It's just I was drawn to it. And I can only sort of say that I allowed myself to be drawn to it, disregarding the consequences.
Okay.
And I guess that's a bit sort of nature rather than any conscious decision. All I knew is that I wanted to go further and further away from the things that scared me in England, which was a sort of provincial, middle class, if you like, predictable lifestyle.
Right.
And that was horrifying to me. And so, going to New York was brilliant, which is one of the reasons I came back to New York, was because it gave me that boost of confidence, or at least gave me the courage of my convictions.
Right.
So, I'd done a couple of years there, and I just thought, well, this is it. Japan is doable. Let's do it. Something I'd always wanted to do.
What did your family think?
Well, that was the other lucky thing. They were very encouraging, and they trusted me. And I wasn't entirely idle in those couple of years in New York, but, I just grabbed a bit of work when and where I could. There was no direction to it, but they didn't say anything. And then I arrived in Japan, and they still didn't say anything. And then when I did get into the instructor's class, that was like a definite thing. I mean, that was sort of, I know for us, it's just training, but from the perspective of, my parents, I guess they thought it was more like a sort of post-grad degree, which was very serious and would result in a qualification.
Yeah.
And so that was the first time they expressed relief, which showed me that they hadn't been particularly comfortable with my lifestyle choices. But they knew it was my life, and for that I'm extremely grateful. So, I basically left England at 22, which is probably not that young in most people's perspectives now. But remember, that was before the internet, before credit cards, before mobile phones, before anything like that. So you go. I mean, I spoke to my parents, every few months maybe, and you work out ways to reverse the charges on a phone box, and then you'd be able to call home, and the parents, I'd call a phone box. That's what I was doing in Japan in the beginning. I'd call a phone box in New York and reverse the charges. And so whoever I was calling was waiting at a certain phone box. Wow. And they'd pick up the phone and they'd say, yes, I accept the charges. And it was a pay phone. So you work these things out. I mean, now, maybe actually thinking about it now, maybe I was the pioneer of WhatsApp. Where
sounds like it.
It's a no-brainer that you have free phone calls around the world now.
Yeah.
I mean, that was an expensive business before. It's like you try making a phone call from a hotel now. You can't believe that they're even charging you, never mind the costs. It's crazy.
Right. And here we are having a conversation across the oceans between Beijing and New York. And
exactly.
It's a crystal clear connection, and people take it for granted.
Neither of us are worried about the bill,
and there's no bill. And so I can understand when you first left and you first went, it was a different world. And in fact, I think Japan is a different world from when you were there than it is today. I mean, I think the Japan that you were at, the society, even the structure of the the JKA and karate there, that's no longer exists.
It's strange because wherever you are, you always think that you've missed out on the previous time, which was tougher or more authentic or whatever it was, and of course there's an argument for that. But I think what was great was that the sort of legends from the 70s and the 60s were still relatively fit, healthy, active people. They were in their 40s and early 50s.
Yeah.
So I did cross over that. And when they started fading away, things definitely changed. I mean, the culture in the dojo is, myself included. I mean, the way I teach now is not at all harsh. I mean, I make the training hard work. Obviously, you've got to drill things. But, the way you speak to people and the language, and we've all been influenced by, for want of a better word, woke culture, whether we agree with it or not. It's had an influence. And, I mean, sometimes the pendulum swings too far one way, but, generally speaking, that's how society should move.
We had some connection issues for a few seconds here.
Get on with it, and you didn't quite sneer at others, but you just sort of felt superior because your body was fully functioning and you're immortal, you're never going to get injured. Yeah. And I think a lot of the Japanese sort of stave off injury longer than the Westerners do, it seems. They don't have the trouble with the knees and the hips that Westerners seem to have. And so that sort of generation were untouched by any consideration of weakness. Mm-hmm. Whereas when things started to become more of I'm thinking of the World Karate Federation, who are those behind the Olympics.
Yeah.
They've existed in various guises over the years, and it first started with having tournaments with more points involved. So it sort of, it sort of disqualifies the idea that someone could travel to a tournament and lose by a decision literally in a split second and they go home. And so there'll be 3 points, and then it went to 5 points, and now it's like an 8-point spread. And, you've got to look at the ramifications of all these things. If you do, and it's exactly the same with training, if you have a slight, and I always call the basic training, the training of refinement is basically what refinement means. You're getting rid of poisons and toxins in your movements and in your body. So if your body has a little anomaly of a physical sort of flaw in your movement, then that's a poison. You've got to burn that away and get rid of it, because otherwise it'll get covered over and buried, and it's still there. Forging the sword is a perfect cliched analogy.
Right.
You've got to get rid of all the little lumps of slag that might be in there. Otherwise, the sword's going to let you down.
Well, that's why they fold it so many times. Yes, it's to get the impurities out.
Yeah. So it's perfect for what we're doing, and I think when you look at anything you do, you have to exaggerate it. And if you exaggerate it, does it become clearer and purer, or does it become a bit chaotic? And I think the problem with the sports karate now is that you're exaggerating this sort of, well, the athlete, oh, poor lad, he's traveled all the way and then could lose in 1 point. It's not fair. Let him have another chance. And so you've got to exaggerate that. And now we are where we're at, where for me, I mean, I don't think this is controversial amongst any of my karate buddies.
Yeah.
The Olympics was just a farce for karate.
I wanted to ask you about that specifically and what your thoughts are. You have I remember there was a section in the book where you discussed, I
touched on it. Yeah,
you touched on it very briefly, but I think this was pre-Tokyo,
absolutely.
I
was because this has sort of been building up.
Yeah.
And of course, once the Olympic dream has been dangled, then people just start throwing money at karate. And once you start throwing money at it, then you start getting, political characters in the actual technical side of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so what happened in Tokyo was absolutely, in my opinion, the worst of two worlds.
Really?
I think the only good thing about it is that karate was on people's lips. And so from a dredging it back up, to sort of a higher level than, or not higher level, but a higher public consciousness of taekwondo, which started to become, it was always called Korean karate. And then it seems that since it got in the Olympics, people were comfortable, taekwondo people were comfortable saying the name taekwondo, standing on its own, not being attached to the word karate. And that was good for them, but of course, not so good for karate. So it brought it up there. However, the worst of two worlds, what I mean by that is that they were presenting karate to the public, and these tough guys who do karate and everything else, massive pads, but no contact. And you've got to have one or the other. You can't have both.
Yeah.
Because, let's face it, everyone's watching UFC.
Yeah.
And these guys, everyone understands that they need to wear some sort of glove, some sort of mitt. Not very heavily padded, I grant you. But probably they're using the bare minimum you could get away with. And people know that, you get hit by those guys. They don't have much padding. And you see the noses split and the eyebrows split and all that sort of stuff. And I think if you took away any mitts whatsoever, I don't think anyone would complain that there wasn't much contact. But when you have the mitts in karate, and they are big mitts, I mean, we're talking about, I would say, 5 centimeters of padding.
Yeah.
A lot, 3 inches of padding. And then, skin touch. Yeah, I'm sorry. First of all, it's bad for technique.
Well, it becomes a whole new game. It
should be called Olympic combat. That's what they should call it.
Well, this is, look, my background was I used to work for the International Wushu Federation, and I was the actual technical representative for their Olympic bid, and we were bidding again at the same time karate was bidding for 2020. I presented to the Tokyo 2020 Commission in Tokyo in 2000 and I'd say 15 or 16, I can't recall. And I presented in Lausanne and St. Petersburg 3 times to the IOC. So I've seen what happens when you're trying to push something to fit into whatever their model is that they want it to fit into, know, and I'll agree with there's a way to do it, and there's a way to try to make sport promote and develop an art, but it's a very fine line. And now we're sitting in 2022. I mean, in hindsight, I would say that I don't know if that line can ever be you can ever walk that line correctly. Maybe I'm a bit cynical, but I think that there.
No, I agree 100%. I think there are certain things that lend themselves to the Olympics, and that's probably much, much closer to the original sort of the military elements of, running, jumping and throwing things. And when it comes to combat, you've got boxing. Boxing is, right there. They've got all the rules, everything's going, and it's boxing. And that there's going to be, that each fighter is going to take quite a few hits every round, and it's just accepted, and that's how it is. Yeah. But of course, there are a lot of people saying that boxing is too dangerous, et cetera, which of course is probably true. And you can't then take another fighting art, which has kicks as well as punches, and make it safe. I mean, how can you have hitting someone safe? You can't have that. And so you've got to have a ritual and a discipline hierarchy that involves morality and involves a recognition of the lifetime of practice, rather than absolutely the fundamental antithesis of the philosophical sort of scrolls that you might get on the dojo wall, which is, basically it's not the winning, but the taking part, these fundamental human classic philosophies, and it shouldn't be about the winning.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's hard though, because it would be like if I were very wealthy saying to a poor person, money doesn't actually mean anything. I just forget about making money. No. It's easy for that person to say. And it's sort of easy for me to say because I have had, quite a good karate career. But at the same time, you've got to learn from that experience. You can't only mimic it. But I do think that competition now is very, very hard. I mean, we have one once a year when we have a sort of summer camp. And so we have 4 days of training and half a day is for the attendees to have a competition. And I try and reproduce the same scenes and the same environment that we had in the golden age for me, which was the sort of the 80s basically. Right. And it's great. And a lot of people are reluctant. And the reason why people are reluctant is because there's this sort of idea of the super athlete can only do competition. And I think that's not true at all. And it becomes truer when you have the sort of Olympic criteria. In other words, you're basically playing tag. You don't have to have very good form at all. That doesn't seem to be a criteria. You got to touch the other person on the chin, or you got to touch them with your foot somewhere. And if you're quicker and have lightning reflexes, and if you get bundled over after you've overextended yourself, but if you touch the other person, you'll get the point. And I think it's demoralizing for people, whether they're sort of cognizant of that or not. And so they just don't want to do it. But I always give everyone a bit of a lecture saying that this is part of your training because, and I myself, a couple of years ago, I entered a tournament in Japan, and I was asked to. It was a sort of masters division over 50, a bunch of old boys. And my immediate reaction was, I don't do that sort of thing anymore. That's ridiculous. But then I thought, well, why not? Am I too superior to enter a tournament, with these old boys? Or am I afraid? And neither of those two reasons were valid, in my opinion. So I thought, listen, let's apply it. Let's enter. Let's show my karate rather than try and win. And that's how it should be. And because, I always loved it. And I don't know if I quoted this particular part, but I always loved how the sumo wrestlers were when they were being interviewed, and they would always say, I will go forward just trying to do my sumo.
Yeah.
They always said my sumo, and I loved that, and I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to do my karate, and it worked out pretty well. So I was pleased with that, and I sort of give a bit of a sort of make a lesson out of the competition, and just basically tell people that that you've got to face your fears. That's part of the martial process. Shying away from those things is not going to make them go away. They will come back and bite you someday.
Yeah.
But you know what? Win or lose, you won't regret it.
Exactly.
The other thing is, it takes the athlete thing away to a degree, which, let's face it, you could be a brilliant athlete, but someone could catch you with a lucky punch and you're flat on your back with a broken nose. That can happen.
Yeah.
And so when you have, one point, and the obviously if you've got 8 points, the criteria is lower because you're getting a point, the other one's getting a point, you're getting a point. So the criteria just sort of like ping pong. But when you have 1 point, the referee is looking to give like 1 point. So it better be good.
Yeah.
The timing, the power, the potential for damage, but the control that's necessary because you're not wearing mitts. And so what can happen is that, let's say, and I mentioned this in the book, if someone is vastly superior, they might beat the other person very easily. But there's no humiliation involved. But if that person is vastly superior and they're getting 8 points to 0,
that's different.
The poor other character is completely demoralized and crushed. And that could be a really like long-term emotional, sort of cloud over their heads. They might quit karate or whatever,
Yeah.
So, that 1 point is like, ooh, yeah, he nailed me with a really good technique. But you sort of live to fight another day.
Yeah.
And it's like everyone can come back from one. But coming back from a humiliation is not really, it's a bit of a different thing.
Yeah.
So anyway, they're the thoughts on sports karate now. And I don't see us getting out of that hole. But as you mentioned, when you start getting involved with the Olympic, the layer upon layer of bureaucracy and money and financing and marketing and perception to the public and safety and including everyone, it's like, yeah, let's see how much equality and equality of outcome will be great. That would be even better. Yeah, that's someone's idea. And those ideas get traction. And that's how things are. So I think I'd rather do something, frankly, esoteric.
Yeah, I see it from another point of view, and I'm not so much involved in the karate side, so you might have to correct me on what the format is in the Olympics. But with Chinese wushu, the sportification of it already it made huge changes to the content and method of practice from the traditional arts. That was already one of the big issues. The second big issue with sportifying it and then going deeper into even down to try to get into the Olympics is the focus or the specialization, which I found to be one of the biggest problems as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
We had either guys that were doing forms or either guys that were doing the fighting, and they'd focus on that.
Yeah, that's exactly the same. And I think at a high level, whether it's a Chinese art or a Japanese art or carpentry or dance or whatever it is, all these principles meet at the top, and there's a like-mindedness with people who approach it as a lifetime pursuit with sincerity. And that's why I'll never knock any martial art, because it's not my field and I haven't seen the best. And if you see the best, then you understand it immediately. But this is exactly the same. In the Olympics, you had the forms and you had the fighting. And there is no way one of those fighters would be able to do the forms, and vice versa.
Right.
The ones doing the forms, they're more concerned about their eyebrows and their hair gel and the cut of their uniform. And also it becomes bizarre, becomes a caricature. Did you see much of the Olympics, by the way, for karate?
I watched the bits and pieces of it,
With the forms, walking out, talk about robot stiff.
No, exactly.
Self-conscious, and for to be stiff like that and to be self-conscious, for me that smacks of fear. And they disguise their fear by screaming the name of the kata, which was never done in my day. You barked it out with a strong voice, but that was it. But it's like, well, a strong voice, can we make it stronger and louder? And then it became a competition.
Yeah.
Who's got the loudest
Yeah, I've seen that.
scream?
I've seen that.
Unbelievable. And, the kiais, the big shout, there's normally a couple in each kata. That should be short, sharp, guttural. Instead, it's a massive, massive long scream that, it's just for the ignorant judge to be impressed.
Well, there's correlation with Chinese martial arts competitions because with the
I don't doubt it. No.
they separate the forms events into three main styles as it is at the moment. I'm not going to get too much into this because it's a sore point, but one of them is the Southern styles, and Southern styles classically in China have vocalizations of various types depending on the style and etc. And it also has become, not only are there no differences in the vocalizations, because within these Southern arts there's not just one vocalization. Depending on specific styles with certain techniques, they say and vocalize different things. But that's all gone, and now it's become the loudest screaming competition.
There you go. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's just losing itself, and then it becomes a competition based on who can scream louder, who can do all these things that you've just mentioned. And for me, that's not what martial arts are about. We've lost one of the most important components, the core components of one, the spirit, two, the entire process. The art is systemized in a way which has an entire process that develops a result, and that's gone. That's gone when you when you're focusing on one thing or the other thing, and then you're taking out X, Y, and Z from the art. And for me, that's it. We're no longer doing the art anymore.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, it's like if you look at the proper Olympic sports, proper, that's a bit sort of controversial to say that, but let's just say the 100 meters.
Okay.
Everybody knows that's the 100 meters and the marathon. They're the two events that really are, without them, what the hell is the Olympics, but just, a bunch of people playing games. So, when you look at the 100 meters, there's a short window, whatever genius you are, whatever, Bolt characters and all those guys, whatever you are, you've got a short window where you are peaking, and what a glorious thing that is. You can't have that in martial arts because by definition, it is the path you've chosen to live on throughout your life. And so, I accept that there's a small window where competition is great to test yourself. You're youthful and you want to pit yourself and you want to see if the technique has any validity and all that kind of stuff. But then you move on. That doesn't become the whole reason behind it, which is why in the old days, everyone, with few exceptions, did both events.
Yeah, that's the way it should be.
And the fighting. And very often you had what's, the what would you call it? The combination champion, where
overall,
there will be an extra.
Like an overall champion, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The Sogo Yusho. So, and this person has either won the form or won the kumite or won both, but placed in both. And, to be in the top three of both, hey, you're going to get this special recognition. But that doesn't exist now. I mean, I think that ended really in the 90s.
Really, that's a step backwards. In my opinion, that's a huge step backwards, Yeah,
as you say, people specialize. And, what's interesting about what we do is that although to the layman, you might have specialized in Chinese arts and I might have specialized in Shotokan karate, but, we can get together and recognize common core principles because our respective arts are complete. Not the same at all, but they are complete. And so they overlap other arts. There's commonalities of excellence that are universal. And I think if you have a principle, and for me, it's just what I'm drawn a little more to the Japanese aesthetic and to karate than I am to the Chinese.
Right.
But that doesn't make me feel superior in any way whatsoever. But I also know that what I'm doing is genuine, and I know that you put me in a room with anyone doing any art, but we're going to get on.
Yeah.
We're going to have lots to talk about, lots to share, lots of nodding and agreeing and everything else. And I think I remember I had an experience with a German guy who was it was a very good Wing Chun teacher,
Okay.
and he was leading a group, and I was leading a group, and we happened to be in a venue where both these things were happening at the same time. We had the same host, and he had his crowd with him, and then I met him, and he was extremely respectful and polite and everything else, but he was trying to do a sell job on me about his Wing Chun and trying to tell me what it was and what they did, and they did things this way and they did things that way. And he wouldn't really let me get a word in, but I just wanted to put my hand up and say, look, hey, I get it. We do the same thing. And what you're saying is absolutely right, but it's also what I'm doing. But so don't try and tell me something because you know it, thinking that I don't know it. Yeah. Because we probably both know the same things.
Well, that's what I found over the years, and why I appreciate the martial arts is not for me to look at the different arts and see how different we are, but I start to see more of the similarities, you know, and
definitely. And I think, you know, that only comes with age. And so you could say only that's wisdom for you, basically. I mean, you know, and things sort of circle around. I mean, I remember I was in Paris for a couple of years before I came back to the US in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And I was in a dojo there, and I was teaching the karate there, and it was a great dojo. They had a wooden space and they had a matted space, and a couple of times a week the jiu-jitsu guys would come in, and you know the French can be a bit abrasive anyway and quick to argue, but I remember I wasn't arguing, but I got a lecture from some woman who was there telling me that jiu-jitsu is obviously the best because we won the UFC and it's obviously the best. It's obviously the best. I was just thinking, well, you know, okay, well, let's see what happens when the money goes up in the UFC and the strikers start becoming more than just barroom brawlers and they become top flight strikers, just like they've got top flight jiu-jitsu guys. And sure enough, boom, it came out. But all I said to her was that, you know, well, in jiu-jitsu, you know, you've just got to think to yourself, would you rather lose a match by tapping out or by waking up in hospital with your jaw wired up? Because that's the difference, you know. So you can clearly win in jiu-jitsu with, you know, very effective, very tough, rough and tumble. You know, I mean, it's a tough art.
Yeah.
But, you know, just because we control things doesn't mean that it's not effective. We control it because we have to.
Well, I think people are quite naive in their understanding. There's no superior method in one way. You can't go to one extreme and say it's going to work all the time. You can't. Yeah. We're all going to try to be the best at what we do, and there's going to be people that do something different to you that are going to be better at what they do than you are at what you do, and vice versa. And you know, it's this whole argument about people trying to say which is the best style is a bit silly in my opinion, because you're going to be asking that question forever. And as you said, as one guy gets better at one aspect, the other guy improves the other aspect, and it keeps going back and forward. As a whole, the art...
Yeah, it's totally futile. And it's also immature as well. Yeah. And, you know, you get all these keyboard warriors on YouTube and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
it's crazy. It's crazy. It's like looking at any sport or anything, really. I mean, you know, you look at football from the 1960s and you see, you know, someone dribbling, and they were fantastic in that era. But you see them now, the ball control that the whole team has. You know, even the defenders can dribble past and do all these tricks with the ball. It's just a different age. Yeah. And if you're the best in some age, it doesn't mean, you know, it's like people saying, oh, you know, well, Bruce Lee have beaten Mike Tyson. I mean, come on, it's a crazy, crazy thing to do. And people love speculating that stuff.
Yeah, well... Anyway, that's just the way people's minds worked. If I may, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your times back then. When you first got to Japan, did you speak any Japanese?
Well, I'm not a bad mimic, so I used to want to know all the Japanese terms for the karate techniques and everything, and I had some influence from a couple of Japanese instructors, but not that deep. But you know, I would save my pocket money and go over and train when I could. into central London and the big training camps they had there. So I had an ear for the sound.
Okay.
But no, absolutely. I mean, and I always advise people when they start learning Japanese, they say, oh, I'm learning katakana now and I've got to learn the hiragana. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with those terms.
I am.
Yeah. So you'll know that, they're just phonetic alphabets, really. And I said, by all means, learn that stuff, but don't learn that to the exclusion of anything else that should come later. The reason that's there is because that's what kids do in their first grade at school. But those kids are already speaking Japanese. They grew up speaking Japanese. First of all, you've got to learn to communicate and just bumble your way through with words that you keep hearing all the time. And, this is from my own experience. I learned katakana, hiragana easy. But what was the point? Because you couldn't understand what you were reading. If you can read the sounds, then, well, it's all very well. But do you know what the Chinese character, the kanji, would be that precedes the hiragana that is the verb ending? So the conjugation. So I'm, as you can probably tell, I'm happy to just babble along and chat. And my first year in Japan started getting embarrassing after a year when my language wasn't very good. But after a year, a couple of things happened. First of all, you gradually do start picking it up, of course. But secondly, people are less shocked when you do say a few Japanese words. And it was always a bit off-putting when you say one Japanese word and everyone makes a massive deal out of it. And you're sort of reluctant to say the next word because you're not really sure what the next word is. So it was just a sort of saturation process for me. I mean, I looked at it like a sort of osmosis, if you like. I thought, well, I'll absorb it eventually. And my Japanese is not fantastic academically, but I'm very good at communicating in Japanese, and my accent is very good. So people feel comfortable with me chatting in Japanese, and that'll do for me. I don't get a chance to speak it that much now. I mean, the occasional phone call, and the brilliant thing about our smartphones is that you can just tap away in hiragana and it'll give you the options for the kanji, and you can just click there. So you start to learn a little bit more and sentence structure, and that's really hard. You absolutely have to proofread whatever you've written, or I do anyway. And then you think, no, that sounds a bit weird. And then I talk into this thing now. And whatever comes out, I make sure that what I said is what's written down. And, normally with a few tweaks, it's pretty good.
Oh, good.
So, I didn't formally study the language at all. But, literally, when I got into the instructor's class after 2 years, your life depends on it. You better flipping know what your seniors are talking about, because if you get it wrong, you just can't upset them. And people see that. And a couple of people have said about my book on reviews that, what do you think he was doing? Getting beaten up all the time. How could you go through that? It just sounds like bullying. I didn't see it that way at all.
Well, that's actually one of the topics I wanted to talk about was what was the training was like back then, because it's a different world today. And that's probably why these people are making comments like that, because their mind is probably thinking that all time is as it is today, which is the most moronic mentality to go through life thinking.
Well, I mean, look how ripe everything was for the pandemic.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just risk adverse through the roof. And, the idea that, I don't want to get onto any political discussion about the pandemic, but, there are parallels there. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the average age of death is 83 in the UK. And the life expectancy is 82. So it's a little bit like, well, okay, so everyone has to suffer for the life expectancy age group to live, how much longer? That's a bit harsh and everything, but in the same way, that's the mentality of the world now. And people look at anyone punching anyone in the head as, well, that person should be in prison.
Yeah.
That's abuse. That's this and this. But I didn't enjoy being hit, of course, but I enjoyed being in a position where I might get hit. And I think that's the big difference, because it was real. where everything's sort of pretend, and no one dares to hit anyone. And, I mean, I'm not saying that that's not a bad thing, I mean, no one wants to get hit, but the risk of it, the reality that there is a risk, and dealing with that is where the character comes in, and
Yes.
how people can say, well, karate develops a strong character and confidence. Well, yeah, but not if you're wrapped in cotton
Yeah,
wool.
exactly. If you know,
And the kids
yeah,
know the
yeah,
difference.
that's it.
And yeah, I mean, I don't have my own kids, sadly, but I've taught a lot of
Mm.
kids, and I've learned a lot of those lessons. Whether they're sort of 4 years old, and I mean, I obviously have a lot of experience, but I don't shy away from teaching 5-year-old beginners. I want to teach them because I want the experience, and I want them to have my experience as well, and it's very, very good for me. But you also realize that what, you can't tell everyone good job all the time if they haven't done a good job. You've got to steer them, and then when they do it well, they know that you mean it.
Right.
And so the honesty factor is, for me, everything. And I find it dishonest to claim to be doing a martial art, but taking away every risk element involved. I mean, people do these extreme sports, which I wouldn't do. I mean, I wouldn't go bungee jumping.
Yeah. Or free climbing.
I just,
Like people are, I was watching a documentary recently of people that do free climbing, climbing up
oh
a rock
God.
face with no ropes. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. There's a wonderful movie about a genius in that. It's called, oh God, what's it called? Oh, I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, this guy, and normally he was kind of a sort of, a bit on the spectrum kind of
mm,
guy, and very dorky and kind of weedy looking and everything else. But he was a genius at climbing, and he was a free climber and everything else. And in practice, he'd have the ropes and he'd fall. But when he didn't have the ropes, he didn't fall, obviously.
mm,
And a bunch of his friends had died and everything else. But, one thing that gave me goose pimples when he said it, because normally you look to a real fighter for for being for credibly making such a statement. But he said, when I'm on that rock face, I know that if I make the tiniest error, and I know deep in my being that everything's going to be over and I'm going to be dead. And so I have to be tuned in to the point where I transcend everything else in the world. And that is the goddamn warrior spirit.
yeah,
And I was like, wow, when you have this dorky guy talking about something nothing to do with martial arts, you realize, wow,
yeah,
that is exactly the perfect thing to say, and the most appropriate thing he could possibly say. Because, doing sparring, and I'm sure you have the same experiences, when you're in a competition, that's not necessarily the warrior spirit. It's
mm,
when you're in the dojo and it goes on for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you are constantly ready, constantly ready. I mean, now things don't get brutal, of course, but with these guys that I was sparring with, I mean, there's a little clip on YouTube of me sparring with
that's
Yahara.
the one that I mean. I've watched that over and over again, and
Did you see the clock?
sorry, did I see that?
See the clock in the background?
I didn't pay attention to it. No.
That was over 10 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I mean, I don't remember that particular incident in detail, but I do remember flashes of it. But it was a long time, and uh, that sort of thing. I look at that and I get butterflies in my stomach, not from fear, from excitement.
Well,
And Yahara gave me that because
yeah.
he was outrageous.
He's one the one character in that became totally fascinated with after reading your book was this character Yahara, and
Yeah.
I started watching whatever I could watch of the guy.
Mm,
He
mm.
is truly unique and more special. I think that's the right word to use for him.
Absolutely, 100%. And as I wrote in the book, there is a slight psychotic aspect to him. But, I forgive him for that because, you don't want a normal sweet guy because he's not going to have the other extremes. And I think, you need to, and I always wanted to meet and witness and hopefully be inspired by, because I'm not one of them, but I hope to be inspired by these outliers and these eccentrics and the people that do things to an unreasonable degree and, what makes them tick. And of course, sometimes it could lead to, serial killers, but sometimes it leads to, something exquisite, whether it's in art or movement or business or whatever it is, to meet a genius. And, that's sort of the goal of my life, really. And I've been lucky. Someone like, Yoji Yamamoto, the designer, an artistic genius, no question. Musician, designer, his illustrations are fabulous. He's got a sense of the balance of things and he could design furniture. I mean, last time I saw him, he told me that they wanted him to design an airport in India.
Oh, really?
And
wow.
Yeah, I mean, this is someone that transcends all that stuff. And I remember chatting to someone who was a teacher of architecture in Texas. And he said among the architects, they all love this guy. So they all recognize some kind of sacred proportion that he's tapped into. And, to meet people like that, really, karate has given me the opportunity to meet people like that.
Yeah, you were teaching Yoji at a period in time when you were living in Japan.
Yeah. So I met him fairly early on, and then with about a year to go of my 3-year instructor's training thing, he just said, "Well, yeah, okay, let's start next week." And so from 92, 93 until I left Japan, we were doing karate 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week together. And we became really close friends. And when I left Japan, he was sort of worried that I'd be able to make a living in karate elsewhere without someone like him or Mr. K.
Yeah.
It was also this sort of enigmatic.
Well, that's the word I was going to say, Mr. K. You mentioned him in the book, and I was going to say this enigmatic person, Mr. K. And I don't know how much you want to talk about Mr. K, because obviously you're calling him Mr. K for a reason. But I'll tell you a story which kind of will tell you my underlying thoughts on Mr. K. You can either agree or disagree. Sure. to confirm or deny, no need. But I have a close friend who went very deep into his martial arts, Chinese martial arts as well. He's slightly older than me, and he moved to the Far East at a young age in the early days and learned some, the Chinese martial arts and, martial arts in a big picture. This is one thing that people don't really realize, is that it was something that wasn't on the top of society. It was something on the bottom of society. And
of course, yeah. Of course.
And this friend of mine learned the arts to survive in that environment from older generations. And and he in his time, he also went to Japan. And in his time in Japan, he met somebody that he also incidentally referenced and referred to as somebody K. He only mentioned.
Oh, really?
It's very interesting, and it was somebody that had an impact on him that through their life experiences, and he was Yakuza. So this is my. You don't have to confirm or deny it, but that is where my mind was with regards to Mr. K in your memoir, that he had some connection.
Well, who knows? Who knows? I mean, Japan is behind closed doors with a lot of things, and I went to Singapore with Mr. K one time, and he was shifting money from Hong Kong when Hong Kong was going back,
changing,
going back, being British ruled to being China ruled. And he was a bit worried about his holdings there. So he thought he'd shift some of it to Singapore, and it was, I don't know, 20 or 30 million dollars, and he wanted to open his bank account, and the bank was very happy with everything. And I was there as some gormless translator. I don't know why I was there, but I was in this high-powered meeting as his sort of translator / Man Friday. And the bank said, this is all great, everything's fine. We just got to run it, formality, just run it by the lawyers, and we'll have an answer for you at the end of the working day tomorrow. And he said, no, I need it done now, and I need it done today. And they said, we understand, time is of the essence. We'll get it done, but there is a process, and it'll be as soon as we can tomorrow. And he banged his hand on the table and barked to me, you tell him if it's not done today, the whole deal's off. Today's the only day I want to do it because it's the day I met my wife and it has a special significance. The money means nothing to me. I'll take it somewhere else. But if it's not today, we're wasting our time.
Right.
And the way he said it with such authority, but also he banged his hand on the table. And I was a little bit like, woo, hang on a minute. So he was capable of these sort of sudden bursts. And of course, the bank said yes.
Of course.
And I mean, it's a whole world that I was just on the periphery of. But I had a lunch with a contemporary of Yahara Sensei, who was came out totally different. I mean, he's a wonderful, wonderful man. And we were having lunch one time, and even he started saying Mr. K, because that's all, and he knew him. And but I think people sort of were relieved not to have to say his name in a way. It allowed us to chat casually about him, if you see what I mean.
Right.
And he said, "Oh, you saw him this week?" And I said, "Yes, actually, we had dinner on Sunday, and I'm going to introduce him to." Interestingly enough, bizarrely, I was able to introduce him to an old karate group that he'd always been interested in, but didn't have an introduction before. So I said, yeah, actually, I'll be taking him to this place in a couple of days. He said, I didn't tell you, he helped me in the 70s. And I'm like, seriously? He said, yes. He said, I felt bad ever since. And this was a very successful businessman. He stopped karate, but he was still involved in the sort of organizational side. And he said, yeah, I feel really bad because I never really thanked him properly. But throughout this guy's instructor training period in the 70s, Mr. K was giving him, obviously, the envelopes at the end of the month. And I thought, wow, we're going back here over 40 years. So Mr. K must have been about 30 years old. How did he have that much influence and that much power even back then? But it made me also realize that you have people like that who have so much influence that if they have a responsibility to just help people that they like the look of, or there's a sort of a patron, the sort of the patron of the arts, if you like, where someone needs someone like that for the patron to extend their largesse. And there was one point where I was renting an apartment, and Mr. K decided that no, I shouldn't be renting my own apartment. He'll give me something, and he tried to give me Kagawa's old apartment. And Kagawa was a bit my sort of nemesis, if you know.
Yeah.
And he tried to give me Kagawa's apartment, which would have been great because Kagawa was a family man, and so I'd have had a family size apartment. But the owners didn't want to rent to a foreigner.
Yeah. So
fair enough. And then he said, well, we got this other place. And I said, I'm really grateful. I said, but it's in a district that's on the other side of town, in a sort of business district. I'm happy to stay paying for my own place, and thank you very much, blah, 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 blah. He said, well, where do you want to be? I said, well, this is where my dojo is, and this is where the main dojo is, and this is sort of the neighborhood I'm in. And boom, he found somewhere right in the middle of that. And he sort of chuckled to himself, said, well, he said, you've got a little bit of work to do. He said, I use it as a storage space. And in this space, he had thousands of lithographs.
Oh, wow.
And I opened a couple of them up. and there were artists you never heard of, but I remember I'd only opened up like the third or fourth sort of flat box, if you like, and it was they were middle, and there was, you know, one of 100, two of 100, three of 100, all 100 of
Oh
100.
my.
Yeah, and this apartment was full of boxes like this. I mean, I looked at less than 1%. And I said to his wife at lunch, I said, well, you know, what's he going to do with them? Is he going to display them or sell them or auction? She looked at me in horror and said, that's his collection. And I was like, wow. So, you know, he did. And the thing is, he did that to, quote unquote, help these artists. And some of them were very famous, and some of them just maybe needed to, you know, pay for the roof of their house or something like that. And boom, there you go. He'd buy a bunch of their art, no questions asked.
Wow.
And so that was the sort of character he was. I mean, just unbelievable.
Well, that's
Unbelievable.
great.
So,
I mean, that's
you know, so
yeah.
karate's given me that, as I'm sure your arts have given you access to people that you'd never in a million years meet.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you do something for long enough, you know, you become noteworthy to people like Mr.
Mm.
K. And I think although I don't consider that I went to Japan particularly early. I mean, there's a lot of people before me, of course, but I wasn't. How can I say this without sounding weird? But I wasn't of the same type, if you see what
No,
I
I
mean.
understand.
I could have gone into business. I could have gone into something else, but against all rationale, I chose karate. And I think a lot of Japanese at the time were impressed that I dropped everything to follow that culture.
Mm.
And eyebrows were sort of raised, and you know, I was a former England team, so I wasn't bad. You know, I didn't arrive in Japan, you know, sort of some goofy, gangly, you know, Westerner. I could handle myself,
Mm.
and I think that was enough reassurance for people like Mr. K to immediately sort of invest in me, if you like.
Right. Well, I mean, that's wonderful. So he obviously saw the potential in you, but also saw the you know, your character and your spirit, which he seems to be. You know, I don't know him, so you know him, but he seems to be, you know, what you'd call an old soul who has the eyes for these kind of things. You know, so
Yeah, yeah. I mean, his own family don't really understand him. I mean, I'm pretty close friends with one of his daughters, and she said, to be honest, I don't even know really where he lives. He comes home every now and again. It's like, you know, it's sort of don't ask, don't tell.
right,
And,
right.
the last time I saw him, I guess maybe one of the last times I saw him, um, I he's just too crazy for words. I mean, I was in danger of not seeing him in the last sort of 4 days of my last trip,
Mm.
and I call him. I couldn't get hold of him, and then he sent me a text message out of the blue saying, you know, I might be able to see you on Sunday. And I said, well, you know, I'm flying back on Sunday. What time are you leaving for the airport? I said, well, I check out the hotel at lunchtime, and then that's it. I've got to head back. Okay, I'll call you in the morning, but I'm in Kyushu or somewhere or other. Anyway, I'd I'd had a late night actually, my last night in
Mm.
Japan, and I don't know why I glanced over and I saw that my phone was ringing. So I picked up the phone. It was 6:30 in the morning. It was Mr. K. He was in the lobby.
For breakfast.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh hell. So I said, give me 5 minutes. I got to jump in the shower. So I went down there in 5 minutes, and I'm not kidding you. He greeted me. He was wearing full-on hakama, the whole thing with an overcoat and a trilby hat.
Okay.
And he looked like one of those founders of karate that you'd see photographs of in the
Mm.
1930s, where they're half Western garb, half, you know, traditional Japanese. And I was able to give him breakfast, and we had a wonderful hour chatting away. And I was just like, this guy's been all over Japan visiting temples and just sort of probably sleeps 4 hours a day, maybe doesn't sleep, I don't know. Just sort of showed up and had an hour, so thought he'd come by and see me, and then had to rush off and go somewhere else.
Wow.
Amazing.
An enigma.
Yeah.
That's the right word for him, I think.
Totally.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone understands him.
You in your book you mention the two main areas that you trained in. You yourself training in the Hoitsugan mostly, and then there was the head office as well.
Yeah.
What was the delineation? What was the difference between these two locations?
Well, when I arrived in Japan, the Hoitsugan and the Honbu dojo, the headquarters dojo, was only a few hundred yards away, and the great founder of the JKA, Nakayama Sensei, who died a couple of years before I arrived in Japan, as I mentioned, he built the Hoitsugan as a sort of dormitory for people to come together from around the world, and often staying there were junior instructors in the 70s. So there were a few, who became sort of name instructors that stayed there when they were, new to Tokyo or poor or still just going through the training program and everything else. And there were a few foreigners there, and one or two Japanese instructors were there. And basically they operated as separate dojos, but they were really deeply linked.
Okay.
For me, they were completely linked. I mean, I would train early morning in the Hoitsugan after we get up, go for breakfast, and then train at the headquarters. But there were a lot of people that had never been there who were at the headquarters, knew the name but had never been there.
Oh.
And vice versa. There were Hoitsugan people who, they would be foreigners usually, and they'd had jobs, so they'd come for 7 a.m. training and go to work after, and they wouldn't bother training anywhere else. So, you had that sort of thing, and they weren't the same dojo, but they were deeply related, and probably more so in the past, because when Nakayama Sensei was alive, he would have been back and forth, and I'm sure a lot of his books were photographed there, and so sometimes it would become a film studio for a certain technique or something like that. He was very prolific with his publications. And so it was a convenient sort of studio / private dojo for him. But it was separate fees. It was 20,000 yen a month to stay in the Hoitsugan, which included training. So that was $200 a month, including training. And it was $100 a month at the headquarters just for training. So, you pay 30,000 yen a month, which wasn't very much. And you had all the training you could possibly imagine. And I mean, that's good and bad. I mean, the only regret I have really is not exploring other dojos and not even going to Okinawa. And this was part of the political aspect of the JKA. Not that it was deliberate necessarily, but there was a general culture that we are the best and why bother going anywhere else.
I see.
And so, you didn't, because I was ambitious and I wanted to be in as many classes as possible all the time. So they knew they could rely on me, because that's one thing that the Japanese do really appreciate is consistency.
Right.
So, I didn't want to be someone, milking every opportunity I could get outside of that, which is kind of a shame, because I probably missed out on a few things. But at the same time, it meant that I went very deep into what I did.
Indeed.
So, yeah.
Indeed. The instructor's training was mostly done at which of the two locations?
Oh yeah, no, that was entirely at the headquarters.
Entirely at the headquarters. Okay, so that was pretty clear in that line, and I guess some of the listeners, most of the listeners wouldn't know that you were the first European to complete the instructor's training, the JKA instructor.
I haven't found anyone else, because, the Japanese have been known to rewrite history, shall we say.
Right.
And there have definitely been a few non-Japanese who, it's a gray area, because, did they do what's the so-called kenshusei, or did they do just a sort of, what would you call it, a severe training course that lasted for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
And that's a bit open to debate. All I do know for sure, 100%, is that there was the Nepalese senior of mine. He graduated the year I arrived properly. And there was a Canadian a couple of years before who graduated. Neither of them are involved in the JK at all now. And prior to that, there were some tough guys that went, no question about it. But they'd often do a year, or they might do 2 years. They might not have understood that the Japanese were saying to them that, you know, you're in the instructor's class, and they probably assumed that they were an instructor trainee, but they might have just been a long-term invitee. I really don't know. There is some documentation, but I haven't seen it in reality, so I can't really verify it. But there's no records in the JKA of them doing that.
Right.
That doesn't mean they didn't get expunged from the record, which is
Possible for sure.
So there's a couple of Brazilians, there's a couple of South Africans. There was an American that I know of who was around in the 60s.
Yeah.
He was a real tough guy. But I haven't heard of any Europeans that have done more than a couple of training sessions in that. So that's I believe that's true.
And what was the training? It was conducted, and the instruction was conducted in Japanese. I'm assuming.
Oh yeah.
Solely in Japanese, and I wonder how that's changed over the years up until today. I know you're not involved in the JKA or the World Karate Federation.
Well, I don't know when the last, because of course the JK had the big split, which I talked about, and then my side in 99, 2000 all split up, and that's when I thought, you know what, I'm not going to go through this again. I'll just be independent. And you got to put a few years in between you, and if you do the right thing, most people forgive you. But the group that remained the JKA, I don't think they've had a Westerner since the 90s.
Oh, really?
To be frank.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's very interesting.
I know they've had a couple of people who have done like a year as a sort of kind of a 1-year apprenticeship thing, to become a full-blown instructor. There was one Canadian that did it in the 90s. He finished a couple of years after me. Maybe 96, 97, something like that. He went back to Canada and things didn't go well. And now it's got nothing to do with karate.
Oh, no.
So, you know, you got to ask yourself whether things were too brutal or whether this and this. But, you know, my situation was totally different. I'm a totally different character. I had a couple of years in Japan where, you know, I had great friends, you know, a good partner, if you like. And when I left, you know, I had the dojo at Yoji's.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say I was living large, but I had a wonderful time. And the instructor's class was just there for me. I was a senpai, I was a senior. I could go and train when I wanted to train, you know, and so I'd still go. I probably did 3 times a week in the instructor's class, and then I was teaching in the headquarters and at my own place. So I was definitely doing enough karate. I dabbled with Aikido and things like that. So that was great. These other guys didn't have that. Of that, I'm certain.
Okay.
Didn't have their own dojos for sure, which meant they didn't have people like Yoji, who was basically giving me a salary.
Okay. And
they didn't have the sponsorship of people like Mr. K or the other guy I mentioned. I can't remember what I called him now. Mizurane-san. That's not his real name.
Of course.
He would that. Now that guy definitely was from. Wow, there was so much about him that just reeks of Yakuza.
Okay.
And he was wonderful to me, though, and he was a wonderful, sweet, kind man. But there were just the signs were too strong, even stronger than, because Mr. K was everywhere. Close friends with politicians, with movie stars, with all sorts of people. So, you know, you just couldn't pin him down. But this guy, it was almost caricature. But he was very elegant and polite and sophisticated at the same time, but different. I mean, different from any other Japanese I ever met. The one with a ponytail and all that sort of stuff. So these other characters didn't have the benefit of that. So they may have well had a miserable existence. And going to the dojo to, you know, for want of a better word, to get a bit of a hazing, they probably just thought, when I graduate from this, I'm getting the hell out of there. And almost without, in fact, I will say without exception, anyone that graduated, quote unquote, or at least got a certificate of attendance, they were gone. They were gone.
Wow.
And if they did graduate as I did, I wouldn't say yes or no to that because I don't know. But if they hadn't, and the word had got back to Japan that they said they had, they would have been pretty much persona non grata in Japan
Oh, okay.
and treated badly. So no one can dispute, I mean, the other group of the JKA, they can dispute whatever they want to dispute. But the fact is that our group was legitimate as theirs was. They ended up winning the court case. But I can't say I was anything else because that wouldn't be true either.
Right.
So I'm sort of accepted. But there's one guy who's become a very good friend of mine, actually. He was perfect material for instructor's class with the current JKA. And had he done the instructor's class, it would have been in the early 2000s. But he chose not to. And I'm just wondering whether the culture was just too much for him because he'd gone to Japanese university
Okay.
as a karate sort of specialist. And so I've known a few people who've done that. And well, they don't want to go through that. They don't want to start at the bottom again.
I see.
Because if you reach fourth year in a university, I mean, that is really hazing. That's a brutal environment, and I felt sorry for those
In
kids.
the university, yeah.
Wow. Oh my God.
Yeah, you talk about that university. It sounds like an incredibly brutal place. I mean, you mentioned fatalities. I've heard other stories from other places about. I don't know if that's.
Well, as far as that, yeah, it can go as far as that. And I mean, obviously, there's a percentage that do come through and carry on doing karate, but well, the vast majority, boom, they want nothing to do with it. And years later, they might join a local club, just train. And as I mentioned, they've always got something. You can see that there's a core movement there that's quite profound. But I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And the few foreigners I know who did go to Japanese university, they're scarred by it, definitely.
Right. Yeah, that's a topic I wanted to actually get your thoughts on. I mean, you went through such a. I mean, it's hard training. It's a harsh environment. It was a tough, grueling, process that you went through. And how does that contrast to the way you hand down your karate today?
Well, I mean, I look at it as in my life because I've lived in quite a few places, and I'm still very English. I've lived in New York for, a couple of years in the 80s and more than 20 years now. So, you try and take on the best of your host country. And so, I try and retain whatever Englishness I think is admirable, try and take whatever American stuff is that I think is admirable. And the same with the instructors class, and probably when I left Japan and I went to Paris, and I didn't really go to Paris against my will, but I was offered a job there, and I thought, you know what, if I don't take this job now, I'll never take a job ever again. And which happened to be the case because I enjoyed the job, but it wasn't me at all. So I dropped that and decided that karate would be my future. But I found myself in Paris, and I was sort of cajoled into teaching, which I didn't mind. But my approach must have been pretty harsh because a couple of years later, I was there, and one of the people who was in my class in the beginning, they were like, we were so scared of you in the beginning because you were so mean to us. And I didn't think I was, so who knows? I'm fairly, probably the thing that's changed more than anything is my tone of voice. Okay. I was probably a bit abrupt. Whereas now I'm unforgiving, but only if someone's doing something wrong and they need to do it right and they're not listening.
Okay.
It's like, you've got to do it right. Not because I'm mad at you, because I care about you doing it right, because you cannot do it wrong, because there's no future in that. So there's a sort of relentlessness about my teaching, but I think it's the languaging and the phrasing is much more sort of thoughtful. I mean, this is the other problem with the JKA. I mean, you come out of there and the way everyone treats you. I mean, across Japan, I mean, really amazing. In total acceptance that everything I say is probably correct.
Oh, really? Very interesting.
You find yourself talking to CEOs and they're listening. Oh, yes, sensei, yes, sensei, yes. And you don't know what you're talking about. You're just spouting stuff, and there you are talking to a 50-year-old CEO as if you've got a valid point of view. So you've got to catch yourself with that stuff.
Yeah, you do. Yeah.
Suddenly you think that you've got the answer to everything, the world's problems, which obviously is not the case. But I think I got out of that fairly quickly. And of course, being in New York and then making a living from karate, what I didn't want to do is have a big commercial dojo. I wanted to attract people who were looking to do something authentic. But those people are usually, professionals. And, I found myself in the lucky position of having several private students who, high net worth individuals, if you like. And to keep students like that, you have to challenge and push them, but you have to be on a bit of a tightrope.
Yeah.
You can't really upset them. I mean, it's just not on.
Right.
You can't hit them, obviously, but you want, and then this is the beauty of what we do. You want to give them the challenges and make them feel the danger, but you've got to be good enough to not actually put them in danger.
Right.
And you've got to push them and convince them without being, condescending. And so, your teaching style evolves to incorporate a whole bunch of considerations that don't exist in Japan. Because, you say something, everyone just says Oss and just gets on with it. And no one questions anything. And it's the easiest environment in the world to teach in. Because if people come to the class and they bow in, they're yours.
Right.
Simple as that.
Right.
I think my teaching is informed by what I've done, but I don't see myself as being an instructor in the mold of what I might have been in the mid-90s. I think there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then, and you run a dojo, and while you want it to be financially viable, you don't make any concessions to the hierarchy in the dojo. I mean, I've cracked a couple of people who, they sort of push their luck a little bit. And I remember one guy, he's actually a private student of mine now, since the pandemic. He was just doing the regular class before.
Right.
And he was a bit bolshy and not the most popular person in the world to pair up with. And I just had hip surgery. And so I was just playing around, just through a very sort of slow kick, just to get moving and feel the distance. And he grabbed my leg and tried to bundle me over. And didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with that. And then he carried on as normal. And then there were a couple of more things where I thought, you know what? I've got to hit this guy on the chin. And I hit him pretty hard. And suddenly he put his hands up and said, whoa, that's too much. I mean, what you do? And I said, I pointed at him, I said, there's a reason for everything. And then, he looked a bit sort of startled. And then we carried on the class. And afterwards I spoke to him and I said, look, you've got to realize that when we're paired up, I'm basically coaching you. If you put me in danger, I'm going to change gear.
Yeah.
Whether it's consciously changing gear or whether it's reflexive. So you have to ask yourself, oh, but I thought this was okay. I said, you can do what you want with the others, but not to me, because I'm different. I'm a different level from everyone here. It's my dojo. You're taking my class and you're going to put me at risk. Never mind about the post-surgery thing. Can't happen. Oh, and you sort of saw the penny drop. And I think this is one of the sort of downsides of not that I'm saying it's wrong, I am 100% equality of opportunity.
Right.
But politics now is a little bit more like equality wherever you are, and whether you're in the beginning or in the middle or whether the outcome.
Right.
It's like the No Child Left Behind, or everyone gets a medal and everyone's a winner. I don't agree with everyone's a winner.
Well, then why is anybody going to try?
Well,
Yeah.
exactly,
So.
exactly. So, and also it's like, well, so what are you saying? Some people are not worthy of more respect than others. Okay, that sounds a little bit a bit sort of defeatist in a way, because then you don't have any sort of natural selection. So you're basically going against nature in its purest form. And I don't think that's a good
Well,
idea.
we found that over time. It often takes time before we realize it, but when something is pushed in the direct opposite, the opposite direction of of something natural, eventually it's gonna lead to something falling apart in a very negative manner. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very scary, these ideas. There's shooting rockets up into the stratosphere to lessen the piercing rays of the sun and all that sort of stuff.
well, yeah, exactly. I'm even talking about people suppressing what we consider to be a normal or natural way to think or act or do. We've seen the results of what happens to a person when that is suppressed for long enough. It comes out in very what is pervert. It
Yeah,
comes
I
out in
think,
perverted ways. It doesn't. I don't mean perverse in the sense of something disgusting.
yeah, no,
I'm
I know
saying
exactly what you
completely
mean. Yeah.
unnatural. It comes out in
Mm,
unnatural
mm.
ways. So, I
Yeah, well, that's what you see. I mean, there's a lot of confusion out there as to what the correct behavior is, because every year there's like a set of rules of how we're going to behave, and this is the right way. And, on the surface, they might even, they're well-meaning and everything else, but, I don't know if you've been reading him. I don't know why, but he's somehow a controversial figure. I just think he's a brilliant speaker and a brilliant inspirer. Is Jordan
yeah,
Peterson.
I've read some of his stuff. I've seen quite a lot of
Yeah,
his
yeah, and
presentations.
equality of um, of opportunity is 100% desirable, but you can't start saying, well, we haven't got enough women in engineering,
Yeah.
or this minority is underrepresented in this field, because there's no end to that. And there is a natural selection, and he always cites places like in Scandinavia where they have the most sort of liberal, progressive rules in society for a long time. They've done the experiment for longer than anywhere else, and women tend to choose certain professions and men tend to choose certain other professions, and I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see why we should force things
Yeah, let
into.
people just do
Uh,
whatever they naturally go towards. I mean, that's it.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there is an overcorrection, and maybe it was necessary, because I do feel like the world. Well, it's actually I'm probably going to contradict myself in two seconds, but you sort of feel the world. Well, you feel the world is kinder until you look at comments on YouTube, or even the comment section of national newspapers.
Right.
People are still horrible.
Well, I think there's a couple of things to that. I think that I must say the last 2 years of the pandemic and a lot of people being in isolation again has changed people emotionally in some strange ways. So I've
Mm,
seen a lot more of that coming out
yeah.
online because it's a safe, well, it's almost an anonymous kind of safe environment for you to say whatever you want
Well,
to.
yeah,
So
absolutely. And not just the pandemic. Also, if you're part of this sort of progressive, you're swept up in the progressive thing where your natural inclination is stifled, it doesn't mean it's going to go away. And it's got to have a release somewhere. And I think it does come out
well,
online.
yeah, that's the other issue with the online thing. So you'll find the worst of the worst finding its way out there. I'm not so sure though that that should be taken as a representation of people. I mean, you know very clearly how you're going to act when you're in front of someone. It's only you
Yeah.
find this online, and yes, I understand that the impact is the same, but I don't think it's a representation of how society will conduct itself in in a person
Mm,
to person situation. I
mm,
think
mm. Yeah, no,
we
I think you're right. That's the other, obviously, to follow up your point about the pandemic, when all these kids are studying online, um, what's that going to do
Yeah,
to
exactly.
their brain development in terms of, social
Yeah,
intelligence?
exactly. But I
Mm,
mean,
mm.
we've kind of come to another point. But I wanted to ask you that, coming off of that last question with regards to
Sure.
how you teach differently to how you went through your training in those days in Japan, and how the struggling, the harshness, etc. But that's what made you. I mean, is there
Mm.
any I mean, do you ever consider, or is there some thought in your mind that it's that process that made you, and if it did that to you, would it not be something that you'd want somebody else to go through if the result could be a similar outcome?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. But you have to be very, very
Mm.
selective. And so what I've had the last few years, and it's something I'm probably more proud of than anything really, is a kind of Kenshusei
Okay.
program. And it went through a whole gestation thing, how to do it. And, New York's quite an expensive place. And, you don't have the kind of people that you would want be able to live and survive in such an expensive
Mm.
city, and, leave their families. But, at the same time, because I travel so much, you do meet people who, are totally, totally committed, but they might have families and jobs and everything else. So I decided to do a 1 month instructor program.
Okay.
And since the pandemic and since I've moved dojos, I can't do it now, but for a few years, it was just great. And I had about 3 or 4 characters a year. We had one woman, but, mostly
Mm.
guys, and probably 15, I would say, over the course of a few years.
Okay.
And they would come and shadow me for a month. And they stay in the dojo, very Spartan. Anyone can do that for a month.
Right.
They pull out their futon and sleep in the dojo and potter around. And it was a wonderful, wonderful thing because, I tried to give them the best of my experiences in my Kenshusei program, which of course lasted for 3
Mm.
years. But you sort of condense it and do the best stuff. But having them stay in the dojo was the best thing because it meant that they were saturated in the
Mm.
environment. And I would come in at 8 a.m. for a private class, which they would also join. So they would be doing the private training. And then if there was nothing much during the day, we might do an extra hour. And then there'd be 2 or 3 classes in the evening. And so they join all those classes and get everything wrong. But I gave them my experience, which was, well, you've joined this program. It's totally unfair, but you're suddenly supposed to know everything. And that sort of unsettling, I think there's a term for it in psychology and in military training, where you deliberately sort of confuse someone.
Okay.
A lot of these things I've only learned post fact, actually. But what you found was that they're trying to be perfect. And of course, no one can do
Yeah.
that. But they mess things up in the way they do the laundry, or they'd move something in the dojo because they thought, well, maybe we'll put it over there today. And so they couldn't get anything right.
Mm.
And they'd go upstairs. My wife had a yoga studio upstairs. And they'd say, he doesn't like anything. He doesn't like anything. And they'd pour their heart out to her. But they'd show a brave face to me and they'd carry on. And then, that first week would be horrible to them. But, physically they weren't that tired. So they were enjoying the training and they felt like, you know what, the training's going okay, this and this and this. And then the fatigue would kick in the second week where they hadn't really had much of a day off, been, 20, 25 hours of training over the week. And another week comes along and their body's not really recovered. So they start to get tired. And of course, by then, start to get covered in bruises as
Mm.
well from blocking and striking and just day after day after day. And a strange thing would happen because they'd start getting things right on the peripheral stuff. The laundry would be perfect and the this and this and this. And then by the third week, they were starting to be hardened. They were getting hardened to the training. I'd come into the dojo and they'd look at me almost with a smirk on the face, like try and find something wrong because I've got everything right. So they took real ownership of the dojo. They'd started establishing a nice rapport with the students who appreciated their presence very much. There was less harshness from me because they were actually getting it right. And the karate was evolving quite rapidly because instead of, cajoling someone to do it, it's like, you got to do it, otherwise you're wasting my time. I mean, you're here to be an elite member, and this is not elite, so it's unacceptable. And they knew that they were there, and they'd left their families, and they'd gone there, and they're like, Jesus, I've got to make the most of this, so I've got no choice but to change. And then we ended the fourth week, and it was like, I've only got a week left. Oh my God, I'm going home soon. And there was a sort of sadness about it being over so quickly. But one of the great things is that many of the people that came through, often on Facebook, there's like an alumni now, and they're right, it's the most profound karate experience I've ever had. That's staying that month in New York and blah, blah, blah. And they're all like, yeah, I can't believe it was just fantastic. Blah, blah. And so I sort of skim over these messages and see them. So now, since the pandemic and my circumstances have changed, and I don't have a dojo where anyone could stay now. So I can't do that. So what we do is on one of my weekends to, let's say, Norway or somewhere like this, we'll make a week there of alumni. And so they'll come for an extra week. And of course, if they do enough of those weeks, then they'll progress to, instead of being a C-level instructor, they'll be a B-level instructor or whatever. Okay. So, in some form that's constantly evolving, which I haven't sort of had a master 5-year plan or anything, but it's just a natural evolution. I mean, who'd have predicted the pandemic? So you do what you can. I mean, once a month I'll have a Kenshusei training online, which will be free, and it'll just be the group that had stayed with me in New York. So, there might be 8, there might be 15 or 20 show up, whoever's got the time on that particular day. Okay. And the best experience I had with that was one of these weeks where the Norwegians had a great group, and they had, how many did they have? They had like 2 people that came to stay and 2 people who wanted to do it, in the current form. So there were 4 of them, and there were someone from Iceland and someone from something. So we had about 7 or 8. And for me, it felt like the instructor's class all over again, because to see them bonding with each other, all knowing that at a certain point during that week, and we'd do a week, so we'd have like a weekend seminar with the regular students, and the regular students would rest after a few drills or 20 minutes, and then it's like, okay, Kenshusei, you're up, boom. And they would slog their guts out to demonstrate what we've been training, because of pride, because of their position, because of just the whole circumstance, and knowing that they're supposed to be better than everyone else. And also the friendly rivalry between them all. And during the week, we'd have the trainings where every single one had some sort of fault. And so we'd spend an hour specifically on one or other of the person's faults and the training we can do to get on that. And of course, the person who was the catalyst for that would get a hard time.
Oh, okay.
Because it was their error that they had to iron out. But everyone had to do the same training. So some people didn't have that fault. Some people probably had the same fault, but it was well disguised. And you got the feeling that they were like, ooh, it's your turn today. And then it would be someone else's turn the next day. And by the end of the week, they all looked at each other. Their eyes were sparkling because they knew that they'd all done it successly, got through it. It wasn't actually that bad. But, they'd done something harsh and survived it. And I think that's a human just a natural goal is to achieve something that took a real lot of training and work and worry and hardship, and it was worth
struggle and overcome. Struggle and overcome.
It was valuable, and you overcame the struggles, yeah. And I think that's a instinctive human thing, and taking that away from someone, I think, is, you can't make things easy for
everyone. That's not possible. But that's great, because you've, in some ways, in your own way, as best fits the environment that you're in, you've recreated that environment that you were forged in, and I think that's great. I think that's
you can't reproduce it as is, but you just take the key elements the transformative elements, if you like, the necessaries, and you repackage it and try and make it relevant for today.
Yeah. Do you still keep in contact with any of the other, the like Yahara and those and people like that?
Very close to Yahara still. We have a very good relationship with two or three of the younger instructors. Kagawa, yeah, that's the only tricky one. A couple of them have died.
Yeah.
A couple of them are sort of semi-retired, but there's three or four that I get on really well with, and we're all in different organizations now. So it's a great thing that we can come together, and I feel like I now can talk to them adult to adult instead of sort of sheepish nodding junior who hasn't really got the right to express an opinion.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, the book was a wonderful memoir. As I mentioned in the beginning, I recommend it to anybody, not just people that do karate. I think the listeners,
Byron, thank you very much.
the listeners of this podcast would really enjoy the story. And I wanted to ask you one last question, and it's coming back to the title of the book, which you say, "How I Learned to Just Say Oss." So, what does that line mean? And
Well, I mean, it started off, the sort of working title for the book was Just Say Oss, but I thought it was a bit sort of trite and a bit too, obscure. Anyway, I mean, the point was that, when you're teaching a class, as you may know, and when a class is sort of intense and you've got a certain amount of work to cover, and there's 20 people in the class, and then someone asks a dumb question, it's a little bit like, just do the work and you will discover. What we're doing is esoteric to a certain degree, and as I explain in the foreword of the book, just say Oss, or the intro of the book, Just Say Oss. Oss is basically bowing your head and saying, I'm here to humble myself and not and suppress my ego, and just to not complain and just work head down and
just
work.
get on with it. Yeah.
And yeah, exactly. And that's the sort of kind of semi-literal translation of the word, but it's very, very prevalent in the karate world. And so, quite often the answer to some things, I will always give an answer, but I say, you're better off just say Oss and get on with it, because you don't really want to stop the pace of the class for a back and forth between a student who's just sometimes even asking a question to show that they're interested. I mean, that's a flipping waste of time.
Right.
If you've got genuine concern where you're really struggling, you just don't get something, that's understandable. But you do get some students, I'm sure who ask a question to seem clever for other people.
Right.
And so sometimes you'll just say, yeah, just say Oss and get on with it. And because they want to seem like they're part of the inner circle, they do just get on with it and just say Oss. So it was clear that in Japan that was the only way to operate, because there were no questions asked by anyone almost ever. And in the instructor's class, I was the one who was asking questions. And but I already knew how to say Oss properly at the right time. So I could sort of get away with pushing the boundaries of that as long as I did everything else right. And I mean, a part of it also is sort of, allegorically referring to how can I say, the sort of tiptoeing through the cultural landmines, where the sort of analogy of saying Oss in a dojo was the same as, not being a dumb foreigner in Japan, because, you're going to get labeled. And there's a lot of them on TV. Very often you get, foreigners on TV that are just sort of caricatures. And I mean, the Japanese sort of like that because they have their own caricatures. It drives me nuts. They've started to be a little better now recently. I've noticed recent Netflix movies and things where they don't always have the ridiculous clown. Where you look at what China's putting out, real high quality. In Korea, I mean, forget it. Korea has it's phenomenal movie industry now, and the Japanese always sort of resorted to slapstick. and that's changing a little bit. But that's obviously not real life. So maybe that's part of Japanese culture. Taking natural characteristics and expanding them to the point where it becomes kabuki or
Okay.
manga or something like that. That's probably part of their character, to sort of highlight those things in a way that we might have seen, I suppose, in the silent movies. But I think they're starting to get the message now, because they're probably must be looking across the water and seeing the success of the Korean
Right.
movies
Right.
internationally
Yeah.
and the Chinese stuff nationally.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
Well, that's very. I mean, it's quite interesting to hear your perspective on Japanese aspects. I mean, for us that didn't live there, we see things without the eyes that you see them. I mean, like you just said, the comparison of the movies. It wasn't something that I quite like to watch movies from all over the place. So,
Yeah, yeah.
but I wouldn't have seen it with
Yeah.
the depth of experience that you had in Japan. So you see it a little bit more critically than possibly others outsiders would.
Well, yeah, I'm, obviously you could say I'm a Japonophile, and so, it's hard to love a place and then see things that make you think, why do they do
Yeah.
that? You know what I mean? So, then you look around, you think, hey, they could do it more like that. That could be perfect for this and
Mm.
everything else. But yeah, yeah. Well, I hope we have a chance to talk again,
Yeah.
and it will be more about you than about
No, no, this
me.
was great. I
And
mean, this was about you and your journey, and hopefully, if the pandemic settles down, I'll go visit my brother-in-law in New York, and if you're there at the same time,
sure,
I'll
sure, yeah,
definitely.
I'd love to meet in person, and who knows, maybe I'll make it to mainland China as well
Oh,
one day.
that'll be great too. So yeah, well, welcome to see you here. I'll take you around. You'll have a good time.
Excellent, excellent. Well, it must be getting late for you now, Byron. It's middle of my day on Sunday, so great
Great
chatting.
chatting.
Could talk for hours and hours, clearly, and still just scratch the surface.
Well, thank you for coming on. I'll put some of the relevant contact info, etc., in the show notes for people that are looking to contact you. I'll also put a link to your book, etc. And you keep well over there. Stay safe, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks very much, Byron. Same to you. And I hope China deals with this whole thing without restricting your life too much. And have a wonderful 2022. Thanks for inviting me on.
So yeah, good. Have a good year. Have a good year. We'll chat soon. Bye bye.